Hello, welcome to my channel and welcome to this video. So I decided that I would like to share my thoughts about what it means to me, divine union. I feel like this is a topic right now that it's very popular. It's being used a lot in ways that sometimes I believe that creates confusion, especially when I'm seeing the people that are talking about it and how they're gaining a lot of popularity, which is nothing wrong. But then over time, their shadow catches up to them to expose them in a way that the terms that they're using to represent an experience that a lot of people have to integrate in their path do not necessarily go as planned or as they thought it to be, or instructed and guided other people to be. Now, I do get that everything happens for a reason, and if I have to learn a lesson of discernment by following a path where ultimately the truth that I thought it was there is not, is a lesson, right? So everything in life is a lesson, and ultimately those lessons is what teaches us to understand the differences between what we think is true based on a physical experience to what we know is true, or the highest truth, right? Highest truth stands on their own. When we put that information, we test it. When we test that information, we see that everybody has the same results, right? So I see this happening with divine union, and I decided to share my perspective based on my experiences and based on the time that I've been remembering and integrating in my path. And that path of integration is not just about the light, it's also about correcting and balancing my darkness. So I had a Kundalini activation back in 2009. What led me into that activation, which relates to, you will see that ultimately everything that I'm speaking to you about relates to a divine union. So prior to that activation, for 2 years, I was asking the universe to help me find a practice or a group of people that can teach me how to find peace. So my life was very chaotic. I had a lot of problems. I was a single mom. And my aim was to find peace. I felt very conflicted. I felt like I had a hole in my gut. So energetically and and physically, I felt off. I felt out of balance. And for whatever reason, don't ask me why, it was just part of my mission, I guess. I decided that I needed peace. And it took me about 2 years before I was able to find this spiritual teacher that I consider my teacher at the time, that practiced Taoism. And for those of you who do not know Taoism, it's a form of Buddhism that follows the way. So Tao means the way. So they study the principles of nature and the principles of yin and yang within nature, and how the energy, the natural or cosmic energy, flows in everything. So they follow that path. And there's different schools of thoughts within that path, which, they kind of are similar but not the same. And it's just a matter of how they're going to instruct the students. So you have, like one that says, well, you got to, learn theory and then put it into practice. And then the other one says, no, you begin with the practice and then you go into the theory. And ultimately, the highest form of Taoism is developing inner alchemy. It's knowing how to activate energy circles within the body that will help you activate the light body and preserve energy. So they're big about preservation of energy, and it's basically moving with the way, moving with the cosmos, moving with the flow of energy, the natural flow of energy, without creating any type of resistance. So that's basically, in a nutshell, the concepts of Taoism, and it's a very generalized definition. Anyway, so I meet this teacher, and at his presence, he's able to expand my awareness. My awareness gets altered. I become more aware that, what I was observing at that moment, there was more. And then he introduced me to Kuan Yin, which is the Buddha of compassion in Asia, in certain parts of Asia. And my body and my cells recognized that connection, and as a result, activated my Kundalini. At the same time, I was introduced to a Taoist form of meditation. I begin to meditate. Now, you got to remember that I come from a place where, for many years, a lot of the choices that I was making was taking me downhill. We got to take into account that frequency in order to understand that when we are in front of someone who's been doing practices of meditation, of self-awareness, of integration, the energies are going to feel very different. And be patient with me as I try to explain all of this, because it all relates to the path of divine union, and especially because it's part of our integration process. We may not all get there to have that type of divine union that so many people talk about. It could very well be because we're getting the wrong information about how to go about it, or because we're not doing enough practice to do it. But at least this information will give you a better idea for those of you who are interested in entering into this path. Not everybody is meant to right now go that far. That's not the aim. The aim, what I see right now of our collective, is to evolve, and in that evolution to begin to remember who we are as energy beings. I feel like this is kind of the aim right now in this time of evolution of our species. All right, so I get my Kundalini activated, and then simultaneously I begin to meditate. And I have to say, a lot of people usually say, oh, I cannot meditate because my mind is too busy, or I don't have time. There's always all kinds of reasons why sometimes we don't meditate. But at that time for me, meditation was the perfect solution. It became very easy to do. I was very excited. I believe that because we mirror back our energies according to where we're at, when we are connecting to somebody else, we serve as a mirror to that person of what is possible, whether it's positive or negative. But there's always a connection. We're always exchanging energy. So all I know is that I noticed an impact. I had an impact when I met this man, but that was because he was doing practices every day. He had done it for a long time, where you could see the results. So there were many people that would come to see him for healing, to find solutions. Well, my solution was that he activated my Kundalini, and that led me into a series of experiences that for a year and a half, it was crazy. It was insane. There were things that I had never experienced before. I couldn't understand them. But I decided that I wasn't going to question them, because from one perspective, I was feeling really good and I was feeling happier. From another perspective, even though there were many stranger things that were happening to me, I felt like it was breaking through my paradigms, and especially the paradigms of the physical constructs that we have in society, the demands of life and the demands of work and the demands that we sometimes have to comply in order to meet our needs. I was kind of fed up with that. So to me, it felt like an outlet that I can escape and have no boundaries. And that really made it better. So when I began to meditate, it felt perfect. And I felt like very quickly I was able to turn my outside in, like if you were to take a pair of socks and turn them inside out. You know what I mean? So I then get to a point where I begin to, have experiences like, remote viewing, astral, traveling, clairvoyance. I mean, being able to meditate 16 hours a day, which I was a single mom with 2 kids, and don't ask me how I did it. And I knew that, it's not that I stay for 16 hours, but I would take, times, and it didn't begin that way. It didn't begin like I was meditating for 16 hours, but ultimately it led me like that. And I would say it was over a period of maybe 6 months, where during that time, the results of that change and shift of energy, it began to help my children, my daughters. They felt happier. We instead of being 2 kids and a mom, it was 3 kids of enjoying each other's company and learning from each other. It was very easy for me to access any type of information, and that was the result of a Kundalini awakening. You connect to the source of the cosmos, and it's kind of like, imagine that when our Kundalini is sleeping, which is this raw energy sitting in the back of your tailbone, your 2 hemispheres of the brain are separate. They're not together. So you are bound by duality in physical time and space. So you see things from different perspectives, and you have to use a lot of discernment when you're going to make when you're going to try to resolve a problem, or when you're going to find an answer to a problem. So when you have a Kundalini awakening or activation, that energy moves through the 2 sides of your body, or 2 hemispheres of the brain, and then it shoots out to the head, the crown of the head, and connects you to the universe. And now you're one. So your perception changes completely. Now, I know that I'm explaining this, and many of you may know already what it is, but I'm going to do it anyways for those people that may not understand those terms, okay? So, of course, my life changed, and my desire to meditate was there. It was natural, it was not forced, and I could see results very quickly. And then, of course, I began to have all of these other experiences of, altering my state. And every day it was something new, something weird, but because it was so weird, I didn't feel the desire to analyze it, which is one of the things that I see today, right now, with people that are beginning in this path, or they have already begun in the process of integration and remembering. A lot of people call that path awakening, but to me, it's not necessarily that we're awakening. It's just that we're, maybe we are. Well, maybe to some degree, we're waking up of a dream where we were kind of, hypnotized and forgotten everything, and now we're kind of like when you're yawning in the morning and you're waking up from sleep, but then you begin to remember. So I remember I began to have all of these different experiences that I didn't understand. And if I became curious, because I was a very curious person at the time, what led me into seek out there was not necessarily that I want to have more experience, or that I needed to share my experiences, even though my teacher was very strict. And anytime I would have an answer, he would tell me, go and meditate, which now I understand the benefits of that, because he was basically letting me know, hey, don't let my views and my perceptions of your experience change the dynamic of the essence of your own experience. Because, excuse me, for me it may appear as something, but for you and the way you're being guided internally could mean something else. I didn't appreciate that at the time, because there were so many weird things that were happening to me that I was not used to, that I was always kind of like, okay, what does this mean? How do I integrate it? Am I going to make sense of it? So what I did was that I became curious to see if other people out there, outside, in my outside world, were having similar experiences. I couldn't find anyone back in 2009. As a matter of fact, a lot of people thought that I was crazy, that I was weird. And of course, this is when I became more isolated by choice. One of the things that happen is you begin to have these expansions, is that you have a better understanding of your limited self, which we call the shadow self. So you begin to see how your ego reacts and responds to situation. Now you have better control of your emotions. You then, as I would acquire information, it's not an information that I would keep in the head and try to analyze. It was something more. It just kind of came natural to me, to be honest, of applying that knowledge and putting it into practice, which I still do to this day. And I always say to everyone I know, information that it's wisdom is power. And when you use it and put it into practice, it empowers you. If you don't do anything with that information, it doesn't serve you well. And the universe, what I've noticed is that it will not give you more information until you put it into practice. So there's a lot of people that are hungry for information and knowledge so that they can demonstrate how much they know, or they can, they have some form of goal, right? So depending on your goal, depending on your objective, is how you're going to be guided. In my case, you got to remember, my search was for peace. It was not for self-empowerment. So that led me to begin to purify my thoughts, purify my way of perceiving reality. And I became very innocent. Not necessarily that I was innocent like we tend to think, like a child, but I knew there were very ugly things happening in the world and around me, but I always felt like I could see the brighter side. And that's when suddenly I began to have these experiences of, all of a sudden, as I was in the presence of my teacher, I would feel like my brain would internally connect to my heart and my solar plex, and all of my senses would get internalized. I would lose connection to the outer world, and then I would enter into a state of bliss. So, like I felt like something, like this tingling sensation all over my body, and then in my head, and then there was like a loss of density, like like mass, like the weight. And I'm not talking about body weight, but I'm talking about energy weight, where something would disconnect in my head. I felt like I would pull back, and if I was standing up, I would fall down on the floor, and I would enter into this state of bliss in which I had no awareness of my surroundings. Because I was not really trained or familiarized with Hinduism or any other practice, right? He was kind of teaching me the path, not by theory, my teacher. Even though he was a Taoist, he was teaching me the school of thought where you learn first from the experience and then you learn the theory. And he wouldn't give me a lot of theories anyways. But he saw that, according to his principles, that I had this natural inclination to Taoism, and he just had a really difficult time understand why when we, I didn't practice kung fu, or I didn't do any type of qigong, tai chi, any of the martial arts. Anyway, so I remember I would enter to the States and I would just lay there until that experience will go away. I think the longest that I was like that was about maybe 2 hours. I don't know, maybe, but he would just leave me there and, and there you go. Now, over time, because, you got to remember, this happened to me back in 2009 and we're in 2025. So there's many years that have passed where I've had the opportunity to begin to integrate all of this information and make sense of it. Now I recognize that that experience is what is known as divine union. It's merging with the one. And after getting away from that practice and going on my own, because I just had to get to a point where I had to make a decision about what I was going to do. My life was not normal. I was responsible for 2 daughters. What I wanted to do at that point was to move to the mountains and live like a hermit. But my teacher was reminding me that no, you're responsible for 2 kids and now you have to finish that path. So I understood it. But my life was so different than everybody else that when I would go to work, it felt like hell, because of the differences of energy, the differences in frequency. And I didn't know how to justify it. And my teacher couldn't show me either a way. He didn't have the means to show me. And now I understand, if I would have been patient enough, the universe would have presented a solution. But I became desperate, and like the ego always do, is that it tries to talk you out of things and into things that, instead of being natural, it is the opposite. It has the opposite effect. So I decided that I had to stop meditating because it was just too much. I was living more of a non-physical life than a physical. And at some point I was asked if I was ready to go, because once you complete your mission and you're not interested in having a physical experience, and then your team of guides come and say, hey, are you ready? If you're just going to sit there in meditation, or you're going to be in samadhi, which is another way of calling that bliss in Hinduism, right? In a state of bliss. And you have no desire to participate, and then it's time to go. So that's when I made a choice, and that's when I began to change my choices and become more physical. And that process took a while, and it was quite difficult. But the one thing I'm going to say, while I was in the high points of, practicing that way, I didn't have any desire to tell the world what was happening. I mean, I had a desire to find people that were going through similar experience, because I figured there has to be somewhere. But I just got to a point where I felt so content. And this is the ideal word to represent my state of being at that time. I was so content, and I was so happy and so pleased and so at peace, because when I met my teacher, the initial experience was of peace. I felt like parts of my body, or my energy fields that were fragmented, came together. So there was definitely that impact of feeling an incredible amount of peace and very connected. That made me very happy. with the lifestyle that I was living. I didn't have riches, yet there was, you know, abundance was always provided, or all my needs were being met. There was a sense of being able to access information as I needed to resolve problems, and the answer was always available. And it wasn't just like, oh, you have to do this and this and this and this and this, and that's going to resolve your problem. You know, the storyline that the mind is used to having in order to assess the problem. No, it was kind of like having this inner knowing. And here, this, pay attention, pay attention, pay attention, especially to those people that says, I have a little voice that told me to do this and this, or I had a goddess or a god that says, oh, you have to do this in order to fulfill your purpose. We have to be very careful and use a lot of discernment with that kind of information, because along this path, as you begin to remember and awaken to those memories, there are going to be entities that are going to confuse you. There are going to be energies that are going to, get involved in your free will and try to distract you from your path. Because one of the things that I learned over time, that the energies that are really, really, like the Ascended Masters, for example, they're really evolved. That's what I meant to say, where they're really evolved. They don't get involved. You will notice them as a source of energy, like Guan Yin. So Guan Yin, the Buddha of compassion, became my idol. And I remember having experiences where I could see her glow, I could see her presence, I could see her vibration, but she never got involved in my experiences or in my lessons. So I hear a lot of people today talking about, because I've been guiding and I'm being guided by this, or I'm channeling this. And this is where I have finally understood, especially a lot of the messages that we have and are left by the Ascended Masters, where you're never going to hear them talk about this. You will never hear a true teaching from an Ascended Master that you're going to have an entity, or you're going to have a voice that is going to guide you and it's going to tell you exactly where you're going to find your freedom, where you're going to have, that ultimate experience with truth or oneness, and boom, you're done. So, but I have my views of why, we think this way. And, this is, of course, based on, a lot of my reflections over time. So, divine union, I enter into those states. What I believe that led me to have that opportunity and that blessing of having those experiences had a lot to do with, one, the meditation. Because the meditation, what it begins to do is it begins to calm your nerve system down. And then it creates this altered states of awareness where you become enlightened. And enlightened, to me, basically is the process that you use to move beyond your own personal beliefs, your own limitations, and see more and take more of what is available to you that you normally don't see through the mind and the senses. No wonder in Buddhism, the senses are known as the thieves. They're always trying to distract you and to take you away from the truth of your reality. So as you begin to have these moments of enlightenment, you acquire the knowledge or the solution to the problems that you have at hand. And now you're not operating based on the polarity of time and space, but you're getting outside that frequency, and you're able to operate within unity consciousness. And now you begin to create synchronicity. And synchronicity, believe me, is a hell of a lot more fun than having to use time to get somewhere. So those process of enlightenment, ultimately, I believe, as you continue that path, and I will tell you, it changes your lifestyle. And because you're getting so much from the meditation, because not only you're able to expand to see more and see the magic of the universe that you live in, but now you're resolving your problems, but you're also observing your limited self, and you're noticing that a lot of the times where you would blame other people for the problems you had, that it was your own problem, that you're the only one that is getting in the way. Your belief system is the only thing getting in the way. Your program is the only thing getting in the way. You know what I mean? So you begin to soothe that part of you where you stop reacting to problems, and you stop reacting to people. There are two things that can stem from this path. One is what the Ascended Masters talk about, snapping the wheel of incarnation, because you activate your light body, and as you activate your light body, now you don't have to use time and space to move from one place to the other. You could do it with the light body, but you have to change your density in this process, and you have to change your lifestyle. So if you're bound by the demands of society, where you have to, make a living, your practice and your meditation are not going to be the same unless you're really focused and you have an objective. And you have to ask yourself, what is your objective? Because a lot of people today, they want to practice because they want to be wealthy. They want to use the principles of the law of attraction, and they want to gain wealth. There's also this idea that what is wrong with having wealth if I am enlightened? And I'm going to tell you, friends, I'm going to tell you something. When you begin to do this work in the proper way, you begin to realize that you're an abundant being, where wealth is not about money. Yes, money is nice, but it's not about money. As a matter of fact, a lot of these people that in the old times, or that maybe today are doing it and we don't see them because they're maybe, living in a mountain and they don't want nothing to do with society, they don't need money. They don't need wealth because all their needs are met. They know this because they already have that direct connection with the universe, and they know how to get it. So here we have to begin to observe and understand and reflect, especially when we observe the leaders today of the spiritual communities, what they represent to us and what they're telling us. Because a lot of them, they're light twisters, as I call them. They're taking truth and they twisting it eventually to their needs so that they can get their attention. The problem with that attention is that it's to soothe their ego. An ego that is out of control, just like anybody else, that stop connecting to that side of them because they're rushing into who knows what. So the Ascended Masters, usually they get away from society because they know society doesn't support what they want. And because they're so focused in their path, they go on their way, and they don't really tell other people what is happening, because their ego now is surrender. And when the ego is surrender, we know and we see and we begin to understand that, the principles of the cosmos, we move with the path, the way in Taoism. And, this is where life begins to become very magical. Now, like I said, there's two paths in this process. One is that you activate your light body, where you stop being caught in the wheel of incarnation, because now you can preserve your body well enough where you can go in and out and use the same body for a long period of time. And I'm talking about years. It could be 500 years, 1,000 years. That's why you're going to have sometimes people talk about how they have seen an Ascended Masters somewhere. It appeared to them. Well, they do it in their light body. Of course, some of them ultimately discard of their body because they're no longer needed. So we got to keep that in mind. Okay, the other path is divine union. And it all coincides. Just remember that we are explaining different aspects of the result when we enter into this path, where we begin to awaken to know what we are, and then we seek And in that seeking process, we begin to become enlightened. And as we enlighten, our lifestyle changes, and then things begin to really take us into a whole different direction of connectivity, being in one, being able to connect in and out without losing our own identities. So I can merge into the one and have that divine union, but for a moment there, I have no awareness of what I'm doing. All of my cells are vibrating at the same degree of unity consciousness, where my senses are no longer necessary or needed, and I have merged with the divine. One of the things that I noticed, to be able to reach this state, is one, you cannot have expectations. Two, you need to have a life of practice. And three, you have to let go of everything you learn. This is a contradiction that a lot of people may find that it doesn't make sense, especially if you're just learning the information but you're not applying it, which is a lot of what happens today. People begin to practice, and especially because plant medicine right now is so popular, everybody wants to cut corners. And I think, from my perspective, that the reason that we're doing that is because our ego is out of control. So we go into an awakening state where now we begin to remember, but we're not doing anything to help calm down our ego. So we're doing all of these different changes, which is very much, part of the expansion of our species right now, because we're definitely in the middle of an evolution, in a time of evolution. So there's definitely an expansion taking place. But because we're not entering into that process properly, it becomes a mess and a disaster. And of course, there's a lot of deception that we hold because of how our consciousness is been fragmented for thousands of years. So there is a tendency, right, because of the way that we have behaved before when we were asleep, to always idealize something or someone, right? Money or people in power, wealthy people. So we tend to idealize them. So when we begin to awaken, we now think that we got it together because our ego is saying, oh, no, I know, I can do this on myself and I don't need anybody to tell me. But eventually we end up meeting someone who may have their energy a little bit more together. They have integrated enough to know better, and you feel, that connection. You feel pulled by that person. But our tendency is to rush things or to dive deep into something without using discernment. That's our tendencies. We have to be honest with our weaknesses and understand them in a way that we're being objective instead of feeling not good enough. So we dive deep without waiting to see and discerning as to whether that person, what they're saying, they can show it with their actions and be consistent. Because maybe they can show it to you one time, but they're not being consistent. So if they're consistent enough, and then you may say, oh, I'm going to follow this path for a little bit and see where it takes me. Because ultimately, my highest truth comes from within. And of course, in that path, I'm always going to find someone that can be of assistance to my development without getting attached to it. Because ultimately, I have the power to connect directly with the cosmos, and the cosmos has the means to provide me with the answers. So, to enter into a divine union, and this is where I want to clarify it, especially to those people that have the confusion, is not with a partner or with a plant medicine. That those paths can help, yes, but ultimately our divine union is between oneself and God. And if you're using a third agent, and then you're not really getting the truth experience, the right experience. But we have bought into that belief that is true, especially because we have these people that are using technology, right? Technology is not helping with the algorithm. I don't know if you notice that right now, a lot of the people that have the spotlight are the people that are wealthy in the, spiritual communities. And they're very good looking and they look very healthy, and they come and they're spitting out always information about, their experiences. And it's not normal. It's you can see that it's not normal. But of course, so many people are so confused and they don't know exactly what the truth path is, that when they hear these other people talking with such a certainty, and they are able to speak and explain this with very eloquent terms about these experiences, that they fell they fall prey to that talk. They fall prey to that path. And that's okay, again, because eventually they're going to learn. There is a lesson to learn, but it's not the right path. And this is what I've learned over time. The path comes from within. There are many signals along the path that are left so that we can learn. But what is our objective? You got to ask yourself, what is my objective? My objective is to have experiences of, unity consciousness or oneness or divine union with God, or to merge with other people and have that connection with other people. It's very different. It's very limited. So nirvana is also an aspect of this. So in that path, there is a point in time where you gain peace, because you begin to see that everything happens for a reason. You begin to understand that there is no conflict in the universe. There's no chaos. Everything is happening to teach us a lesson. And we only begin to harmonize our karma when we stop reacting to our experiences. When we have a handle on our emotional body, where we understand that the only aspect of us that react and respond to protect us is our ego. So once you begin to tone every system down and begin to see the difference between your ego and your higher self and your consciousness, there is a difference. They behave very different. They communicate very different. They choose the path very differently. So once you begin to see that difference inside you, of what one represents and what one does, you begin to react very different, and you begin to gain peace. And that level of peace that you achieve when you stop suffering, because you don't see the limitations of matter. You see that death is not really death. It's a process of change and transformation that is just part of, this reality. And you begin to understand all of these deeper subjects by putting them into practice. It cannot just be a philosophy of the head. It's an inner knowing. And this is the difference between that inner knowing that comes from your divine juice to a voice or an energy that is telling you stuff and guiding you to do things that it doesn't make sense. Very different. So all I can tell you and encourage you is to go and find the true messages of the Ascended Masters, because there's many distortions today that you can tell that maybe in the beginning it makes sense, but over time it doesn't. And you have to pay attention to that, to the level of sensitivity that you feel when you're in a path and you're trying to follow somebody else's truth. There's always a distinction between your instincts and that person, where your instincts will begin to tell you, hey, wait a minute, hold on. But because we let our ego undermine those instincts, we continue that path to later hit a dead end. And can we blame those people? No, eventually we have to take responsibility and accept that we did it. Everything that happens in our life is because we opened the door and let those people in. So when we see this large audience following somebody, and all of a sudden they're going haywire because they're following a leader and they haven't used discernment, it's going to be very disheartening. It's going to be very disappointing. Oh yes, it's happened to me many, many times. So this is where I finally, if I get caught, I believe me, I continue to process my limited self, but I've just reached at that point that I'm understanding that everything comes from within, but there is a process that takes place that we need to be very patient as we are deciding what to do and how to, navigate in this physical, realms. Anyways, my friend, I think I've stayed long enough. If you have any questions, let me know. If you have any comments, please let me know as well. And I thank you for listening, and peace to you.